From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema demands changes to the Democrats' tax and spending bill as listeners respond with emails on Republican primaries, inflation, and the Electoral Count Act. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Alicia Finley. Happy Friday to you both. After a week or so of silence, Kyrsten Sinema has apparently gotten to yes on the Senate budget reconciliation bill negotiated by Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin. But Sinema wants a few changes, and as a reminder, the original deal included about $433 billion in spending and about $327 billion in taxes. So, Kim, can you give us a sense of what Sinema is asking for? And is it a big bite out of the bill, or is it just a little bit of nibble at the corner?
Well, what she did here is focus on two tax provisions that she was not comfortable with. And she has stripped out what was called the carried interest provision. This is what allows hedge fund and private equity managers to pay a particular rate on some of their income. Democrats had wanted to impose higher taxes in that regard. It was a pretty small portion of the bill, considering the numbers. It was worth about $14 billion, but she has got that out. She has also revised the structure of the corporate minimum tax that was included in the bill to ensure that businesses can still engage in what is called accelerated depreciation. This is very important for business investment. It would have particularly hurt manufacturing companies in the United States, so she got that out. In order to cover the revenue that was lost, as it were, from those two provisions, Democrats have now agreed to engage in a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks. This is also another terrible idea. We can go into the substance of it, but the overall point is it will raise even more money than was likely being lost from getting rid of the other two tax provisions. Some of us, the cynical of us, are wondering if that kind of wasn't the goal all along, if the carried interest provision was a little bit of a shiny object, and now we're getting this much bigger excise tax.
Well, on the point about stock buybacks, let's start with a clip from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about this issue and explaining it a bit at a news conference on Friday.
We're adding in an excise tax on stock buybacks that will bring in $74 billion. By way of contrast, the carried interest loophole, as it was phrased, and we took the exact language the House had, was a $14 billion income. This is $74 billion. 5 times. And I hate stock buybacks. I think they are one of the most self-serving things that corporate America does. Instead of investing in workers and in training and in research and in equipment, they don't do a thing to make their company better, and they artificially raise the stock price by just reducing the number of shares. They're despicable. I'd like to abolish them.
Alicia, what is it that gets Democrats so upset about stock buybacks?
Well, I find kind of this debate a little amusing because let's go through the options. What happens when companies turn in pretty healthy profits, like banks, tech companies? They have a few options. They could go on an acquisition by other companies, which, by the way, Democrats oppose. They don't like big companies getting bigger. Another option, and oftentimes, by the way, these acquisitions may not be in the best interest or may not be the most productive investments for companies. Another option is to raise wages beyond the market levels, which would arguably probably push up wages for other workers or other companies. That's actually a couple liberal economists have done a study, and they found that when Amazon raised wages, that actually hurt small businesses because they had a harder time competing for workers. So then, well, Democrats don't want to hurt small businesses, right? Or they can reduce prices, and that would also make it harder potentially for small businesses to compete with them. They would probably be accused of predatory pricing. So what they do is return money to their shareholders through stock buybacks, or they could do it through dividends. The tax treatment of dividends makes that less attractive for companies because investors or shareholders who receive dividends are taxed at the ordinary income level, which would be 40.8% now. Whereas the stock buybacks are basically investors choose to participate in them, and they would pay 23.8% with the Medicare surcharge on that. The other reason why this could be attractive or to businesses is it's a one-time return, whereas dividends are typically steady. And if a company cuts its dividend, as oil and gas companies have done in the past when they were struggling, and I think GE 5 or 6 years ago, it was a big red flag when it cut its dividend. So investors don't like it when companies cut their dividends. Whereas share buybacks, it's essentially like a windfall, it's a bonus. And yes, this temporarily increase the stock price, but it allows investors to essentially use the money and invest it in other companies that could produce even more productive returns on that investment. Here, essentially, the effect of this excise tax would be just to basically transfer the money from investors, from the private markets to the government. So the government would use or spend the money to invest in things that it thinks that the private market should be, but isn't.
And the policy that's being proposed here is a 1% tax on the market value of any shares that companies buy back. And to underline the argument that Alicia just made, if you're a CEO of a profitable company, you have money coming in, if you have ideas for how to invest that to make better products, to make your customers more happy, and to make more money down the road, I think you have plenty of incentive to do that already. But if you don't have those ideas, or you have so much money coming in you can't spend it all, do you want those CEOs to build a shinier, fancier office in their new corporate headquarters? Or do you want them to give the money back to the owners? And Kim, buybacks are just a way of giving some of that money back to the people who own the company.
Right. You make a really important point, because if you listen to Chuck Schumer, he makes it sound as though if you have a share buyback, that there's some nameless, faceless corporate entity registered in Delaware that somehow benefits from this. No, public companies are made up of their shareholders, also the people who work for them, etc. But it's a community of people, including the folks who, remember, why have you invested in a company? You are giving it some of your money to the company for it to make wise decisions, and hopefully you get a return on that investment. And so, as Alicia just explained very well, a share buyback essentially drives up prices, it increases the per share earnings, it signals confidence in a company, and who is benefiting from that? And these are the numbers that kind of back up the point I was just making. 58% of Americans own stock. 60 million workers out there invest in 401ks. And by the way, those 401k programs are the largest shareholders of corporations. 15 million Americans have what are called 529 education savings plans, where they're looking to the stock market to increase the value of their kids' portfolio to be able to pay for college. That is who Democrats are going to hurt by imposing this 1% excise tax. It's not some CEO somewhere. It's millions upon millions of Americans who are going to see this hit, even at a time when the stock market has been roiled by inflation and Fed interest rate hikes, etc.
So, Kim, what's the process from here now that we have Sinema's agreement? I understand the Senate is staying in session over the weekend. What are we to expect?
Okay, so first of all, there's a huge, big, outstanding question here. Chuck Schumer has said, we're going to proceed, but we're all waiting to hear from the Senate parliamentarian, who has yet to make a single ruling on this particular package. I've heard from some sources that it looks like she may be about to the end of the prescription drug portion of the bill, which she's been looking at now for several weeks. And there could be some big doozies in there, depending on what she rules. She is about to begin looking at some of the corporate tax provisions and the climate provisions in the bill. There could also be some wild cards there. Chuck Schumer is making a little bit of a gamble on this motion to proceed, which he says could come today or even tomorrow morning. If he doesn't have all those rulings by the parliamentarian, could be that his decision to set that timeline is in fact an effort to pressure the parliamentarian to finish this quickly. But it's unclear, given Kyrsten Sinema's statement. She said she would proceed, but subject to the parliamentarian review. So will she even vote to proceed if that review hasn't been finished? That's very unclear yet. Once that happens, and if assuming that the parliamentarian doesn't throw a huge cannon in the middle of all of this with some ruling that upsets the balance of the bill, there'll be 20 hours of debate, 10 for each side. Democrats will probably waive theirs. They want to get out of town. Republicans may use some or all of theirs. Then the infamous vote-a-rama, where both sides can offer unlimited amendments, and then a vote for final passage. There are still a lot of hurdles getting from here to there.
One point about the broader package that we have not discussed yet on the podcast is this idea of giving the IRS more money in order to, find people who aren't paying the taxes that they're supposed to be doing. And the bill gives $80 billion to the IRS over 9 years. And that compares with the IRS current annual budget of $12.6 billion. And so, Alicia, that seems like a huge infusion into America's least favorite government agency. What do you make of this idea, and do you think they're going to get the revenue out of it that they expect?
Well, I'm very skeptical of this. I think CBO has even done reports showing that there are diminishing returns for money that gets pumped into the IRS. And in fact, it doesn't score the IRS boost as providing any revenue under its longstanding practices, that it doesn't score laws or funding that's intended to cut down on waste, abuse, or fraud, which is essentially what the IRS boost is. It gives the IRS more money to hire more auditors. And there's some money in there for quote unquote taxpayer services, only about $3 billion of the $80 billion. So most of the money is actually going to the enforcement arm of the IRS to hire more auditors, to increase its technology, to go after small businesses, the S Corps, which are pass-through companies that the left claims are underpaying their taxes because these income streams aren't as visible when banks are required to file tax statements with the IRS showing the interest that they pay on savings accounts. The IRS gets the W-2s, so they see how wage income is being reported. And so they can easily crack down on certain forms of income that are being underreported or aren't being reported, but the pass-through income is much less visible. So this would basically empower the IRS to give it more money to audit more pass-throughs. And this is essentially why the Joint Committee on Taxation actually found that 78% to 90% of the money raised for reported income would actually come from those making less than $200,000 a year. Again, these are small businesses, often independent contractors, sole proprietors. Only 4% to 9% would come from those making more than $500,000. So this really isn't targeting the uber wealthy, who, by the way, will probably find other ways to dodge some of the taxes, or the corporations would find other ways to dodge the corporate minimum taxes. This really isn't intended to go after the corporations or the very rich. This is intended to go after mom and pop businesses. But I'm a little skeptical that it will actually raise the full $200 billion that it claims. I mean, maybe some, people, don't want to get hassled and they'll just roll over and pay the IRS a check. But I think many could actually end up fighting in tax court. When these cases do go to tax court, the IRS has a losing record. So these quote unquote savings are likely to be phantom. We're going to get a big spending bill, but really, I don't think any of the revenues that Democrats are claiming will actually manifest.
Well, Kim, my thought here is, why don't we fix the IRS before we want the IRS to do 10 other different things, which seems to be the Democratic approach here. I mean, recall last summer they wanted the IRS to start giving out these monthly child tax credit payments, kind of turning the IRS into a social spending agency. Then there was a big controversy because in order to control or turn the payments on or off, you had to give your face scan to this third-party facial recognition company. Here we now have a proposal to beef up the IRS and do more audits of people, but yet the IRS did not answer more than about 10% of the taxpayer phone calls it got last year. I mean, am I crazy to think that the approach to the IRS should be, let's just fix it and get an agency that can do the job that it's assigned to do?
Yeah, when you go out and you ask Americans, what's the problem with the IRS? I doubt very much that their answer is going to be, it doesn't perform enough audits. People are furious because, as you said, they can't get the IRS to answer their telephone calls. There were some other statistics suggesting that in some cases, it takes the IRS anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to answer correspondence. The Taxpayer Advocate Service, which is an independent branch that basically exists to keep tabs on the IRS and to support the rights and needs of taxpayers, came out with a report in June to Congress noting that as of May 31st, the IRS was still sitting on 21.3 million unprocessed paper tax returns, which had meant that some taxpayers were waiting 6 months or more to receive their refunds from the government. And, the thing that infuriates Americans about this is that could you imagine if the IRS told you to pay your taxes on April 15th and you said, I'll get around to it in 6 months? I don't think that they would be very tolerant of that. And yet the American taxpayer has no recourse. So yeah, let's try to fix this first. Only $3 billion of that $80 billion that they are proposing is going into what is called taxpayer services, which is the portion of the IRS that deals with taxpayers and which is so dysfunctional at the moment. The problem here, just to your point, Kyle, is that a lot of Democrats actually have a vision for completely restructuring the IRS to be something else entirely. There's a task force in here meant to study turning the IRS into an organization that would actually not just deal with your tax returns, but calculate your taxes for you, allowing you to do a direct e-file. I mean, could anyone think of a worse idea? And one of the reasons they want to do that is not because they want to make it any easier for middle class people to file their taxes, but they want the IRS to have a direct line and link to all the people that they want to send refundable tax payments to, i.e. people who don't pay income taxes now. They want to use it as a new method of funding welfare to Americans.